Bergen. This is the first panel in a stream of 2 panels on environmental hazards and social catastrophes. The threat of catastrophe is on the rise, whether from terrorism, natural disaster, industrial accidents, or pandemics. And a crucial challenge is how to reduce our vulnerability to such threats. And this panel will address natural, organizational, and deliberate causes of disasters, and it will give us crucial insight, I hope, into how to make us safer, how to think about disaster preparedness and resilience, and how to manage crisis. Governing after crisis will be addressed, as well as leadership challenges, accountability, and learning issues. The role of political, administrative, and economic institutions will be discussed by addressing organizational and executive failure, as well as how to organizing for having high reliability organizations. A crucial question is how to reorganize fragile systems. The panel, I think, will challenge the mantra of asserting central control in response to catastrophes, and networks and other organizational forms will be discussed as a supplement to hierarchy. And we have been very fortunate to have 3 of the leading international scholars in this field on our panel today. So let me quickly introduce the speakers. First of all, we have Professor Charles Perrault, sitting to the left here, Professor Emeritus of Sociology from Yale University. He is, of course, the grand old man in this field, and the founder of normal accident theory. His interests include contemporary crisis, accidents in such high-risk systems as nuclear plants, air transportation, DNA research, chemical plants, protection of the nation's critical infrastructure, and currently is working on organizational aspects of climate changes. He is the author of the famous book Normal Accidents, Living in High-Risk Technology from 1984, in which he explains his theory of normal accidents, catastrophic accidents that are inevitable in tightly coupled and complex systems. His theory predicts that failures will occur in multiple and unforeseen ways that are virtually impossible to predict. And his recent book from 2007 is The Next Catastrophe, Reducing Our Vulnerabilities to Natural, Industrial, and Terrorist Disasters. And today we'll talk about the following topic: a neglected option, reducing target size of natural breath, industrial accidents, or terror attack, which is partly based on this last book. I'll also introduce the 2 other speakers before we give the floor to Charles Perrault. Our second speaker is Professor Ian Boyne, currently at the Louisiana State University, where he is a professor of public administration, and he has also been a director at Stevenson Disaster Management Institute. He has also an adjunct position at the University of Leiden, where he for several years was the director of Leiden University's Crisis Research Center. He is also the co-founder of European Crisis Management Academy. His books include Managing Crisis, Threats, Dilemmas, and Opportunities, the award-winning book The Politics of Crisis Management, Political Leadership Under Pressure, and the recent one, Governing After Crisis, The Politics of Investigation, Accountability, and Learning. His topic today is Transboundary Catastrophes, Preparing for a Resilient Response. And our last speaker is Mathilde Bourrier, professor of sociology at the University of Geneva. She is a scholar that has been working in the field of high reliability theories. Theories of high reliability organization is based on the belief that accidents can be prevented through good organizational design and management. She has a PhD from Institut d'études politiques de Paris and has also had a fellowship at Berkeley. Her interests are including safety management, safety regulations and organization, industrial and organizational risks, and organizational reliability. And her publications include books or publications like The Organization of Risk, Challenges for Our Knowledge of Sociology, and the Building Organization Reliability, a comparison of 4 nuclear power plants. So today she will give a presentation on the following topic: organizational lessons, how to learn, organizational design, how to change. But we start our presentation with Charles Perrault. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Now I just that's fast forward, okay. Security alert. There we go. This comes from this recent book, the best part of which is the cover. I just love the cover. And I'm going just to do a very quick summary of that. It's a simple message. Disasters from natural sources, industrial and technological sources, and deliberate sources such as terrorism are inevitable and increasing. We can prevent some, we can mitigate some, but we are not going to be able to escape these problems. At the present, we focus upon protecting the targets or reducing the damage to them or the people involved. But we neglect a more basic strategy, and ultimately, I think, a much more efficient and cheaper strategy of reducing the size of the targets. That is, reducing the concentrations of energy found in hazardous materials, the concentrations of humans in risky locations, and the concentration of power in vital organizations such as these. Smaller, dispersed targets of nature's wrath, industrial accidents, or the terrorist aim will kill fewer and cause less economic and social disruption. Our organizations and institutions are not capable of preventing natural or man-made disasters, nor can we expect them to mitigate these effects very much. I'm talking about many types of disasters, like catastrophes, natural, unintended, like industrial ones, and the deliberate ones, which are supposedly increasing. And all of these have increased in the last 30 years or so and will continue to mount. Our response has been largely prevention. Higher levees on the rivers, safety alarms, border controls, and the like, and mitigation, such as early warnings, better evacuation, or improving the work of our first responders. We fall far short of perfection on both prevention and mitigation, and we always will. It's time, I argue, to look at the targets of nature's wrath, industrial failure, or the terrorist jihad. Now, some of these targets are not reducible, and mitigation is all we can do. Cities will not be abandoned because they sit on earthquake faults, nor can we do much about meteorites, tsunamis, volcanoes, or tornadoes. The spread of destructive energy from these is so vast, rapid, and often unpredictable that reducing the size of the targets will have little effect. And with pandemics and bioterrorism, it's just too easy for their deadly organisms to spread for us to do much more than remediation. But these kinds of disasters are rare. Most of our disasters are much more frequent. Hurricanes, floods, explosions, fires, or as anticipated to happen in our near future, terrorist attacks on large targets or the internet. I actually think those are grossly overestimated, and it's not at all one of my major worries, but if it is a worry of yours, my recommendations include reducing the threat from terrorist attacks. At present, we are doing little about these that is effective. And I'm not going to spend much time talking about our organizational failures. As an organizational theorist and student of the history of capitalism, I am well aware of their failures as well as their successes. And I am also not going to single out the Bush administration as something that is all that exceptional. Incidentally, I should have mentioned that what I'm talking about, concentrations of population, energy, and organizations, is the most extreme in the US. It's not that bad in Europe or the rest of the world. So we are the best example of these dangers, so I will focus exclusively on the US. Now take our response to the 9/11 tragedy. It represents the political and organizational problems we face. Here's what happened when we had the 9/11 tragedy. We got a Homeland Security Department, but it got off to a poor start and has largely fumbled, a very expensive fumble since then. Congress, Democrats as well as Republicans, would not give up any of the fiscal power of the 88 committees and subcommittees that oversaw the 22 agencies that were moved into this department. This is an unsanitized version of what Homeland Security is about. Around the border are those 88 committees. It's been a huge pork barrel as well as a massive organizational failure. I think the Clinton administration just might have prevented 9/11. It twice alerted airports, police, and border controls when attacks upon the U.S. were threatened in 1998 and again in late 1999. And that these alerts were quite successful. We caught some terrorists with them. And the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, was a model agency under the Clinton administration. But the Bush administration, as bad as it has been in the disaster area, is not the main reason for our woes. This is not a case of a special organizational failure of that administration. Under the best of governments, our organizations are bound to fail. So let's do something about the targets. Take nature's targets. Take the period from 1950 to 2000, 1999, half a century. The annual number of natural disasters declared major by the U.S. government increased 4 times. We had 4 times as many major disasters per year at the end of the period as at the beginning. We have had even more since. And most are weather-related. The weather had not changed much, if at all, by 1999, but because of population concentrations in risky areas, the number of people and their dwellings and workplaces and their toys destroyed in risky area has gone up. Disasters take fewer lives now because of better warning and evacuation systems and a better emergency medical care, but the economic costs of the disasters did not increase just 4 times, like the annual disaster rate, but 14 times in this period. They cost about $45 billion a year before Katrina. Unfortunately, they are subsidized by federal insurance policies and disaster relief, both of which encourage people to build unsafe structures in warm, lovely, hurricane-washed coasts with waterfront views, and also in lovely California coasts and hillsides that are vulnerable to floods, fires, mudslides, and earthquakes. New Orleans is a gem, but it's a soup bowl, 10 feet below the levees in a good part of it. Before Katrina, even came. The Red Cross estimated, it was about 2 years before Katrina, estimated the death toll in New Orleans from a Force 4 hurricane, a direct hit on New Orleans, filling the soup bowl, would range from 70,000 to 150,000 people. An estimate of 70,000 to 150,000 deaths. Now that worst case did not happen. The levees were not suddenly topped by a surge, which is what they were considering, but where there would be no time to climb up into the attic and chop a hole onto the roof. But the levees crumbled slowly in just a few places because of the inadequate construction by an organization, of course, the Army Corps of Engineers. So why wait for nature to deconcentrate these areas in such a fatal way? Withdraw the federal subsidies for insurance and announce that disaster relief will not be provided when laws are violated. Yeah. It's going to be hard to do, but we got to do something like that. New Orleans could serve its important economic role as the largest port in the nation at 1/3 of its size, and at that size, it could be protected. Or take industrial disasters. Chemical plants sit next to apartment houses all over our country. Their toxic products can leak into city sewers, as this one did in Louisville, Kentucky, destroying 4 city blocks, which took over 2 years to rebuild. Why such a concentration of explosive chemicals? Our chemical industry is highly concentrated itself, and that concentrates the hazardous materials. Here is a Katrina-related disaster that filled 1,800 homes with oil, rendering them total losses because of concentrated storage right in the city of New Orleans. The tanks were not properly secured. Now, even more oil spilled from these, but they were not in a residential area. They were far outside the town, and they had room for a large spillover facility, which the tanks in the previous one did not have room for. There are 123 locations in the U.S. where a vapor cloud released by an accident or a terrorist attack could endanger over 1 million people, possibly kill more than 1 million people. 123 locations. That means they're in fairly concentrated population areas. The economic advantage of these scale economies are small compared to the risks that they pose. The government should mandate the use of safer substances and smaller and more dispersed storage facilities and prohibit large storage in urban areas. We were lucky with the World Trade Center. There were huge quantities of diesel fuel in the basements that came very close to ignition, which would have made that devastation far worse. This fuel could be brought in a little at a time, once a night, as it's needed, or even once a week. The economies of large storage in the midst of millions of people are tiny, and the risks of such concentrations are huge. In the chemical industry, the larger the plant and the larger the firm, the greater the toxic releases. Big is not safer, nor is big easier to regulate. Concentration in the railroad industry is associated with an increase in accidents, some involving toxic substances in populated areas. Concentration in the electric power industry, following the deregulation of the industry in the 1990s, can be tied quite directly to the giant Northeast blackout of 2003, and certainly to the power shortages and huge cost increases that California, Oregon, and Washington and Vancouver experienced in 2001 and 2002. We are literally eating away at our critical infrastructure in these cases and presenting larger targets for storms, industrial accidents, and even terrorists. A final industrial concentration is less obvious. A key part of our critical infrastructure is now the internet. At present, the net is highly deconcentrated It's the world's largest system. But forces are endangering that deconcentration, and this will reduce its security. In addition, with only one operating system on 95% of desktop computers, Microsoft's Windows has not had to pay much attention to reliability nor to security. It's the big one and the big elephant in the room. For a few years, this was not much of a problem because Windows was used as a standalone facility in company workstations or home computers. But once the internet took off, everything became interconnected, and the unreliability of a workstation in a bank, now connected to vast financial markets, spread, as did the consequences of security breaches. Software failures are responsible for very few deaths to date, but increasingly software, particularly the unreliable and insecure software of Microsoft, is linked to systems with catastrophic potential in the case of failure or terrorist attacks. Of course, most software failures in our critical infrastructure are not due to Microsoft, I expect, but no accounting has been made of the corporate source of these failures. With only 10% of the software market, Microsoft is dwarfed by SAP and IBM. It would appear to be a small player in a huge software industry. But the Windows operating system is so ubiquitous that over half of all SAP customers use it with Microsoft products such as Windows. And it can bring any unreliability or lack of security of Windows into these systems. So Windows-based software plays a critical role in our financial structure, our nuclear plants, our industry control systems, Defense Department data banks, the FBI, the CIA, military weapons and fighting platforms such as aircraft, tanks, and ships. They call it Windows for warships, and appears to be used to some extent in most everything that can kill. Heart pumps, infusion pumps, pacemakers, medication distributions in hospitals, and now the safety of our most widely used weapon, the automobile, run by Microsoft Windows with all its flaws. A good part of the problem with software reliability stems then from the success and thus the concentrated power of Microsoft. It's embedded in all our critical infrastructure. It is improving in reliability and security, to be sure. But if you believe in capitalism, we need a market, several viable operating systems competing, and necessary software that will compete on the basis of reliability and security, where lives and economic damages are at stake, and we do not have that market. Concentration in the telecommunications industry is now occurring in the previously highly deconcentrated area of internet servers, the backbone of the net, but this is increasingly concentrated. So what can be done about reducing vulnerabilities that come from economic concentration? Here are the tools. This is what we have to attend to. But there are at least two major problems. The first is political will, but in every case I have mentioned of vulnerabilities, the U.S. has had laws and regulations that address these issues, but they have been dropped, weakened, or are not enforced. Take a trivial example. The government has tried to withhold disaster relief from those who failed to take out heavily subsidized insurance or failed to conform to regulations, but it has backed off each time when the flood or hurricane actually came. So we don't trust the government to follow up on its warnings. This could be corrected. It'll be hard, but it could be corrected. More important, we have precedents for reducing or preventing concentrated economic power and thus for deconcentrating organizations. 30 years ago, the U.S. had effective antitrust legislation. It could be reinstated. Passed it once, pass it again. A federal judge tried to break up Microsoft. We could try again. The government could be more effective if, like the state of Massachusetts, it required open source operating systems. That just started in Massachusetts as an experiment. We could once again regulate the internet as a common carrier, allowing free access that would limit concentration on the internet. The second problem with reducing economic concentration is the argument for economies of scale. Big organizations are more efficient, it is generally argued. But the scales we have now in the vulnerable parts of our critical infrastructure are so big they are well beyond any reasonable size required for production efficiencies. The huge sizes we have are there to achieve market control and political influence, not production efficiencies. For example, many, if not most, processes involving hazardous materials would still be productively efficient at greatly reduced scales, and this would concentrate fewer hazmats. We are bound to have large systems in our highly interconnected nation, but we do not necessarily need them to be dominated by large organizations. A system made up of many rather than a few organizations has more resiliency and more redundancy. This is the route to high reliability organizations. Resiliency, redundancy, small interconnected systems. While we think of our nation and its economy as highly interdependent, most of the relationships are ones of dependency, and many lack the safeguards of redundancy. A city in a risky area needs multiple redundant evacuation routes and multiple redundant means of protection, medical and other emergency services. If we rely upon only a few, the inevitable failures of some of these puts us in peril. It is similar with our critical electric power system in the U.S. We had more reliability before deregulation allowed concentration of power producers. The internet has been incredibly reliable because it is designed to have multiple redundant pathways between millions of nodes. This reliability is now threatened as internet service providers are consolidating, making them more vulnerable to accidents, hackers, and terrorists, as well as threatening freedom of access by users. The urge to consolidate and concentrate critical functions in large organizations just increases our vulnerability. And we could have large systems as we must without large organizations dominating them. The electric power grid and the internet, now endangered, were good examples of deconcentrated large systems. Two other networks of small firms and two others are networks of small firms, and third last is terrorist networks. Through these four systems, electric power grid, internet, small firm networks, and terrorist networks, though these four systems are highly interconnected, the relations between the nodes of these networks are predominantly ones of interdependency, that is reciprocity, rather than dependency, that is authority. More of our critical infrastructure could be configured this way. And reciprocal relations involve self-adjusting devices and the possibility of self-organization. Increasingly, the reliability of the power grid depends upon so-called intelligent agents, relays and circuit breakers that read incoming signals and make adjustments automatically and send signals for other nodes to make adjustments. We can have self-adjusting systems in the grid. The U.S. government does not demand this investment by the highly profitable electric power industry, but they should. The internet has electronic agencies that search for the best link between nodes. It's an intelligent system. The reciprocity in networks of small firms is more prosaic. It's not all that technical, but it offers more lessons for organizations in our critical infrastructure. Small firm networks I'm thinking of exist in Italy, Scandinavian countries, Japan, machine tool industry, and other industries, some parts of Silicon Valley, and the networks of biotech firms in the U.S. Now, this means small firms that are not networked are classic examples of high dependency. Unnetworked small firms are a disaster. But if they are networked, then we get the phenomenon I'm speaking of. Their reciprocity in networks of small firms involves sharing of information, technologies, market opportunities being shared in the interest of the common good, even while individual firms compete. Knowledge is shared as employees move between firms, and the prospects of the individual firm rise and fall. The firms in an industry, machine tools, textiles, consumer goods, packaging machinery, and so on, support trade schools and a transportation infrastructure. These communities, where they are located, are prosperous and liberal. No single firm dominates. Unfortunately, these structures are being challenged by the mass marketers and concentrated producers in the global economy. Terrorist networks have extensive ties between the cells and sharing information and expertise. Taking out any single cell of a terrorist network has little effect upon its resiliency. Now, I'm not going to go through a summary of these.
2 minutes.
How many?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, good. Okay. But the reliability is high, the efficiency is high, and the control structure is very important. The lowest level in these organizations have high autonomy and are self-adjusting. In contrast to these four, most organizations in our critical infrastructure are centralized and bureaucratic, difficult to change, and the commercial ones seek to maximize profit through market control, which means concentration. Deconcentration will also help in our adjustment to global warming. In most capitalist countries, the enormous power of the oil and coal industry has blocked serious pollution abatement attempts. In Germany, the electric power industry simply refused to obey court orders from the Federal Republic and even the European Court of Justice, orders to invest in renewals. It just said we won't. And Germany could do nothing about it. It was the law. The law can be broken. Carbon taxes are presently out of the question in the U.S., which will go to Copenhagen in October with an empty hand. At present, we are no much better off than the Department of Homeland Security, which can only keep its fingers crossed, and that's about all we can do ourselves. Thank you.
We then go immediately to our second speaker, Arjen Boyne, please.
Good morning. My name is Arjen Boyne. I'm from Louisiana State University. It's a pleasure to be here. Per, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be on this panel with Charles Perrault. I cut my teeth on his work, and I hope I'm going to do him justice here. And it's, of course, always a pleasure to be here with Mathilde in the panel. So today I want to talk to you about research in the area of crisis and crisis management. Social sciences have contributed quite a bit, and I'm thinking about public administration, sociology, political science, psychology. So this is a real interdisciplinary field, and is a field that we can draw from many both theoretical and empirical works. So here goes. And what I really want to do is consider how these crises are changing. So I'm building on Professor Perrault's work here. I'm going to arrive at a slightly different conclusion, but that should make it more fun, where I'm going to argue that rather than dispersing our key industries, we should make our societies more resilient. But these might be complementary propositions. I'm thinking that the new phenomenon that we're witnessing, and this is it's not just playing around with words here in terms of definition, is that we're watching a new sort of crisis that I'm describing in terms of transboundary. And here you see the definition. I won't bore you with that, but here are a few examples of typical of crises that are not typical, I should say. I think you probably might not even know all of them. The Canadian ice storms that paralyzed Canada for a long time, the blackout in Buenos Aires, the recent blackout in Houston after Hurricane Ike, and two crises going on right now that I would describe in terms of transboundary. The what we're now supposed to call the Mexican flu and the unfolding financial crisis. Now, what are the characteristics of these crises? Of course, the transboundary part. And the transboundary part is not just the transnational or transgeographical dimension, but it's also crossing the functional boundary. So what we have is crises don't really fit in neat boxes anymore. Not if they ever did, but they don't really fit in nice geographically confined spaces or in policy sections. The other part is that we really have no idea where it started, when it started, where it's going to go. And the most worrying characteristic of these crises, it really is not clear who should be running the response. There's no, that's what we call no ownership of these crises. Now the insidious, excuse me, the insidious, one of the insidious characters of this type of crisis is that the damages it causes play out over time and come through the paralysis of critical infrastructures. So they're more long-term, and the damages are harder to relate to the immediate causes of these crises. So I think we should be studying these crises. Now my thesis is that we're going to see more of them. And I'm thinking we're seeing two, what I call driving trends. So we're seeing the change of threat agents, and more importantly, the increased societal vulnerability to these threat agents. Now let me start with the latter. The ever-growing complexities and interdependencies. This, of course, builds on normal accident theory, and you should read Charles Perrow's book on that to get a grip on this. And since Perrow wrote this in the early '80s, I imagine this went much further than you ever imagined it would over time. So and now we're catching this in the world is flat argument. So we're living in a society, and we're hearing this everywhere, where everything is connected, and it's becoming so complex that nobody really understands it. The current financial crisis being a very interesting example. The changing societal and political climate. What I mean there is that people expect more of their government, but they accept less in terms of failures. So we're really looking at leaders that really they have no clue what they're running or what they're in charge of. People don't expect any. They don't accept any failures. And compounded there is the rising economic vulnerabilities that we see, especially in our large cities, where we have a tremendous rise in vulnerable populations. So every natural disaster bears this out, and that will have, as we come later in the discussion, that has consequences for the idea of resilience. And finally, the design failures. Charles Perrow just mentioned it. Government has a tendency to focus on what we call the last war. So now we have a Homeland Security Department in the U.S., which was informed by terrorism. A few years later, we had Hurricane Katrina, so everything was adapted in that light. But if one of the disasters that Perrow mentioned here is going to unfold, we can safely expect that Homeland Security will be useless again. The threat agents as they're changing, this is just, I'm sure you can think of 5 different ones. These are examples. The one that I find hugely fascinating is what's happening in the biotechnology and DNA type of research, which is going to have huge consequences. And of course, they're going to be profitable for us and they can be great for us in making us live it longer. But they're going to introduce all sorts of new threat agents that we can't even think of right now. The new forms of terrorism. My home country is the Netherlands. We just had our Queen's birthday a couple of weeks ago, and some guy, a crazy guy, what we didn't say, of course, drove his little Suzuki Swift through the audience, killed 8 people, and was trying to ram the open bus where the Queen was being transported through town. This is low-tech terrorism, similar to the Mumbai events. It's the kind of stuff that, in hindsight, seems awfully predictable. Unfortunately, nobody thinks of it before. So we have long discussions now in Holland why there were no roadblocks there. The climate change, well, I'm sure everybody understands that. The global shifts we're watching, the rise of China, of India, we're looking at Pakistan now, and these are just, it's all just going really quickly. And finally, the demographics. In Europe, it's a big issue, but we heard Professor Sen talk about it yesterday, what's happening in certain countries where the choice for boys rather than girls is changing the demographics, which is going to change huge shifts in the long term. So all this is going to conspire to create new threat agents. And I don't want to be apodictic here. I'm just saying it's going to be different. And it's going to be different in a way. And combined with the idea that we have a more social or a vulnerable societies, that combination is going to make us is going to see different and more transboundary crises. That's my thesis. Two paradoxes that we can note here. I just mentioned, the public leaders, while they can do less to prevent crisis, they're increasingly held responsible for crisis, which makes them very nervous all the time and makes them embark on all sorts of wrong adventures. And the second one is that some of the trends I just mentioned, especially technology and also complexity and the tight coupling, actually enhances crisis management capacity. It makes us richer, it creates technologies that we can use. So there's a bit of an arms race there between making societies richer, using new technologies, which then in turn create new dangers, and then we need more technology. So it's an endless arms race and trying to stay ahead of the threat here. I want to briefly, where am I at, Per? Is it 10 minutes or something? Yeah? Okay. I want to briefly note some of the challenges that this presents for our public leaders. Let me just go there right. We have 5 of them. And this is in a book we recently did, and we detail those. And I'll say a little bit about them. The 5 challenges that public leaders face is, first of all, they got to prepare their societies, but nobody really cares. The second one is that once crises start to unfold, it's very hard to make sense of them. And that has a lot to do with what we were just saying, how hard they are and where they're starting and how they're developing. And of course, every crisis is unique. Then the third one is the ones that we're most familiar with, because that's what we watch in television, is seeing leader trying to manage large response networks and trying to get resources to stricken areas. And we see how hard that is on television. Hurricane Katrina being a wonderful example. The fourth one, meaning making, is the symbolic side of crisis management, where we expect leaders to provide a story that provides guidance to people, what they should be doing and how they should be understanding what is happening to them. And the fifth one, of course, is we want them to learn and make sure that stuff never happens again. So these are, this is easy to state. Let me just very briefly run through them, why they're so hard. And the first one is preparing for crisis. That seems, I live in Louisiana now. You would think everybody there naturally is prepared for hurricanes. And I can tell you that just moving there, nobody ever told me what to do. And then we had one, Hurricane Gustav, and we were without power for about 2 weeks. And that was a nasty experience. And I just discovered that nobody had that water in-house. Nobody had the generators. Nobody had all the stuff that supposedly you were to have if you know that a big hurricane can strike your area. So it's apparently still very hard to convince people, even in areas where you know that stuff is going to happen, to make sure they're prepared. It's expensive too, and so that probably explains a lot. And it's there's a lot of politics in this. Why should money go to places like Florida or Louisiana where people want to live near to the water? Why should the rest of the country pay for that? That's understandable. Of course, the other thing is with planning. You know, we all know that planning doesn't really work for normal life, and I can tell you, it surely doesn't really work for to prepare for events that we have no idea what kind of events they're going to be. So the second one, the sense making, is so understanding what is going on. You know, getting that mental picture. The first point, I'm just going to just say, read Charles Perrow's book, Complex Organizations, and that'll tell you all about why organizations can't make sense of their environment, and certainly why they can't see stuff coming that they're not trained to look for. I'm sorry. I guess the one of the most important factors here is there's so many potential crises out there that it's hard to focus on the crisis that's coming. And we're all looking at climate change right now. We're all standing here. We're sitting here. This is the top of the social science world, and I guess we're all wondering how we can get people to understand what we know is going to come. And I haven't heard a real solution for this. Political scientists speak of agenda barriers, cultures of neglect, of ignorance. The point is that even the most obvious crises, especially they're especially obvious in hindsight, but the most obvious crises are very, very hard to detect in time. And I'll just leave it at that. The managing of the large response network, we have a huge body of work that explains why it is hard to make critical decisions in small groups under stress. That's psychology. Why it is so hard to get limited information during crisis, or get the right information. Coordination, the holy grail of public administration. We never can get organizations that never work together when they really have to work together. That is just that's hard enough. And then all the efforts aimed at accomplishing that usually are counterproductive. And communication to the public is also very hard. I don't want to be very pessimistic here. This is sort of putting all the crisis research findings together. So naturally, we're focusing on failure. But I'll get to some of the more positive points in a bit. The meaning-making story is often, a great example. I thought, whether you agree with him or not, but he did great. It was George Bush after 9/11. He provided a narrative that a lot of people bought into, and he did that masterfully. Interestingly enough, after Katrina, he failed disastrously in providing a similar narrative that could bind people together. Now, we can have all sorts of explanations, but it just goes to show that providing a narrative is important. The one that I thought was interesting here, more closer to home, is after the Asian tsunami, how the Swedish government failed to react to the tsunami by not accepting that, or not in time accepting that many Swedish vacationers were involved in this, and pretending that this was some sort of foreign disaster and not one at home where they should be acting. And then we get all those classic pictures where people go to the opera while the crisis is unfolding. We have that in the US, and we have that in Sweden. And I remember President Putin water skiing after the Kursk, the submarine Kursk went down, and he was water skiing and saying, he was on vacation. So those are the symbolics of meaning making. Learning, we just talked about that. Learning is expected, and it is very hard. And I'll give you one example, because I'm sure everybody here suffers from that when you have to take your shoes off at the airport. It's learning from one particular failed event, the shoe bomber. that never bombed anything, but has something in his shoe. And that's why we're all taking our shoes off at the airport. It's learning. If you want to know how much money that costs and what we could have done with that money, it's kind of scary. So that's speaking of the wrong lessons. Quickly through the lessons, the research lessons. Avoidable failures. So meaning this is what people do wrong all the time, and it really shouldn't be so hard to do it right if they were properly trained, if we can get our lessons across. And some pointers and principles for a more safer society. And I gotta have to do that in a few minutes. These are some of every crisis that you'll study. You don't really have to study it very much. You can read about it. You'll see this stuff. The first one is, of course, denial that stuff can happen here. As I said, I live in Louisiana. It happens there, so that pretty much means it must be happening everywhere. There is the one that I find fascinating is, well, we all know that plans don't work. During a crisis, people then suddenly start following plans and then stick to it. And that is really scary to watch. And in combination with the command and control reflex, where leaders just sort of assume that if they give a command that they will control the situation and act on that assumption, is also a worrying pattern. I'm sure these look familiar to you. I want to move on to what an effective response system would look like. I mean, we're moving to sort of an ideal, typical situation where you would hope that if a large-scale disaster unfolds, that in the short term, citizens, first responders, leaders on the floor would be able to self-organize, would show what we call resilience. And in the long term, you would hope that the leadership of whatever community is being stricken provides a way of returning back to order and emerging as a factor of importance. Unfortunately, it's usually the other way around. In the first stage, we see leaders struggling to do just that, and in the long term, citizens are left to themselves, and we hope that they self-organize. So that should be the other way around, I think. The resilience is really nothing else than the rapid recombination of available resources. Problem is, of course, that the modernization, all those trends that we just talked about, undermine resilience. And they do so in various ways, but the tight coupling, the just-in-time logistics, the lack of daily adversity really leave people unprepared for any sort of disaster. I remember in Holland if the power is off for an hour, or we have snow for a half a day, that just sinks the country in chaos. Why that is, I can only explain it that people are just not used to taking anything anymore. This is where am I? This is the consequence for leaders. So this is what leaders should be doing in the short term. They, rather than trying to control the situation, they should be looking what works in terms of self-organization and support that. In the New Orleans situation after Katrina, the example was there was one organization that was functioning right off the bat. It was the Coast Guard, and did a wonderful job. So leadership should be then, or whether that is in the plan or not shouldn't even matter. Whatever works should be supported. Of course, organize the outside forces. That's what people there cannot do. Provide the narrative and start working immediately on the long-term reconstruction. And accepting that immediate relief is just simply not going to happen because it's impossible. So how do we get there? In terms of, this is a design question. So a nice public administration, political science question. Building resilience and into societies. Now, this is an open question. This is more of a research challenge, and some of these things are short term. Some of these things are long term. Obviously, what we need is trust and working institutions and all that stuff. But that's what we need anyways. So this is more of the easy fix kind of stuff that we can do to help improve resilience on a fairly short term and fairly cheap. So the making sure that some of the basic mechanisms are in place of disaster management. Now, believe it or not, that is still a problem. You know, if you look at Louisiana in terms of sheltering, for instance, we know we have hurricanes. We know we have to evacuate people. Louisiana cannot house its own population. So that is one of the simplest things. And I'm sure this goes for many, many states. Exercising, well, this is, I can tell you more about this if you want to know it. This is standard fare in our in the crisis management literature. I think it also means something for leaders and the way that leaders have to be prepared for these kind of situations, which I'm afraid is, first of all, people don't get selected to be crisis managers, public and political leaders. That might be a good idea, but once they're there, I think they should accept they need a certain amount of training to deal with this, and it's training on the job, and some do a great job, some fail miserably, and I'm not sure if it's fair to say you failed in crisis management if you were never selected or trained to do that. So we should have some sort of mechanism where we train our leaders to deal with crisis, or at least make them aware of the challenges that they're going to face. And this is hard enough, of course, because leaders, as we all know, don't want to fess up that they would not know how to do this, even though we see them fail all the time and doing exactly this. These are the constraints, and I'm going to end here. These are some of the constraints why it's probably not going to happen for a while. The first one is in my I'm not sure how to address that, but there is, and we see that in times of crisis and disaster, an almost symbolic desire of people to have a leader, or to listen to a leader, or to follow a leader, and that reinforces that the command and control stuff, that military approach to crisis and disasters, which we know doesn't work. So there's a big paradox there. There's the second one is the increasing vulnerability of our ever growing cities. We don't know how to run those cities. Certainly don't know how to run them in times of crisis and disaster, and we have no idea what to do with it, or how to evacuate an 8 million city, or how to feed a city that is being the subject of a disaster. The culture of the risk society, I just talked about that, where people just simply expect everything and don't accept any sort of failure anymore, and certainly don't want to pay for it. And then finally, the most worrying probably dimension that we've been looking at is what I call the politics of crisis management, the blame games that now start not after a crisis, but in the midst of crisis, right away, immediately. Again, Hurricane Katrina was a very painful episode in the U.S. where the people were still there on their roofs, and the whole blame game was unfolding and really paralyzing the response. So and I'm going to end on this note. My thesis is that we really need to rethink the way we organize for crisis and disaster management. First of all, because we're not good at it. Second of all, because we're going to see different types of crises that are going to ask a lot more, both of society and political leaders. The positive news is, of course, that actually creates work for us, social scientists. They're going to need us, and I'm pretty sure about that. So I would invite you to become, develop an interest in this field, because we need you, and creates great job opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 25 minutes. Then we move directly on to the last speaker, Mathilde Bourrier, please.
It's not working.
Ha!
It's coming.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of my thoughts. Is it well adapted? Yeah. On high reliability organization or high risk organization. It's also a pleasure to be in front of Charles Perrault. In my generation, most of the students, started in this field because of his book. So it's interesting to confront my thought with him and with Arjen. My perspective is based on ethnographic studies carried in the 90s up to the 2003 in nuclear power plants in the US and France. I did some collaborative work on railway safety, and I moved since 2006 and 7 to skills transmission in anesthesia during ambulatory procedures at the General Hospital in Geneva. So those are my two main fields, and I will actually talk about, my perspective is really based on those studies. An initial question that I would like to raise, and I will hope to answer those. What are the recurrent difficulties such high hazard organizations face daily? What do we know about their organizational responses to these challenges? How to assess their micropolitics of safety? And where are they heading in terms of their design? And I've put here the AZF explosion. Nobody is mentioning it in the literature, and I hardly find anybody who knows about this big catastrophe in France 10 days after September 11. It probably explains why. That ripped off a third of the town of Toulouse, and Toulouse is not a little city in France. It's rather a big city. And no cause determined to date. The trial is actually occurring, and people like me and and citizens are hoping that actually judges will be able to have more information, because it has been a very catastrophic, way of putting the things together, and the police, and then all kinds of problems that could not lead, I think, to a proper explanation. Or it could be a terrorist attack. So it's exactly the example that you mentioned, where you have a big catastrophe that could be explained by many different scenarios. Okay, so this is my little reminder not to forget this Toulouse explosion. Okay, we said it already, that studying high hazard organization is a well-established field now, and making use of the classic heritage that we have on bureaucracies, complex organization, and their dysfunction. So we are not, the field didn't start 20 or 25 years ago. We had things to chew on before that. And we now have other perspective coming from the organizational anthropology, ergonomics, and social psychology that makes for a rich field. We have an ever-growing number of organizations that are members of the club, and I'm sharing, I agree with Arjen that the financial system could also be treated and interpreted with probably our toolbox. So we have nuclear power plants, chemical plants, aviation, and our hospitals are considered to be high-risk organization, probably dating back from the To Where Is Human, the famous report that says it's just unimaginable that people are dying at the hospital. So you're probably familiar with all this. Okay, now I'm making a portrait of what is a high-risk organization. And it's not only me, but I'm sort of summarizing. There's uncertainties in the process that are always present, yet kept minimal by intense surveillance, controls, mitigation strategies, both technical and organizational. That's the famous defense in depth. Second characteristic, staff can only fit their own slot. There's not a lot of substitutability. That allows for top skills and knowledge to be acquired, maintained, but it means that there's hardly possibility, for example, if you take the nuclear power plant example, to move maintenance to ops and ops to maintenance. So people are extremely entrenched. There's a detailed proceduralization of work and activities, still rising, even though it's already at a top level, Work and activities are strictly planned and still rising. More and more subcontracting practices, especially in maintenance, but also moving to other parts of those staff. There's a detailed supervision of work and activities also rising, and those production sites are heavily regulated compared to other high-risk industry, like maybe the financial one. Consequences. Risk keep changing. There's silos emerge, structural secrecy, as Vaughan would say. Knowledge does not travel easily within the organization. Procedures need to be created, but who's in charge? How? Is Taylor still well and alive? I mean, who's creating those procedures? They need to be updated endlessly, and or else they are potentially breached. A fourth consequence, and I would not actually go into these details, is where do the planning folks, in terms of their political weight in the organization, fit in those organizations? Subcontracting practices require, by the principles, a lot of reorganization. It's not because I subcontract that I'm not, that I do not care about my own organization. Subcontracting means that you need to be extremely well organized and reorganized as a mother organization, but it's seldom understood as such. Too much supervision and control potentially create a lack of autonomy, resentment, lack of ownership, delusion of responsibilities. Of course, too little has also its drawbacks. And the same goes for regulation. Like, for example, I take the French example, where nuclear regulators are considered the new bosses of nuclear power plants. And EDF managers are really under the hierarchy of those guys. And how does it affect safety? It was not the case 10 years ago. This is more and more of this, that you can see that they are extremely powerful on site. Those recurrent, those problems that are common to most of those organizations actually translate into problem in how do you design your organization. The uncertainty of risk means that you need to organize his constant assessment to see how it evolves. The rigid division of labor means that you need to constantly battle against ghettos, entrenchment, compartmentalization, and clans, and what we call in French baronies. I don't know if you'd say it in English. The ultra-prescription means that you need to organize for the classic dilemma between prescription and autonomy. How much do I prescribe? How much do I lift up to the people to actually develop their own solution when the prescription is not applicable, which is the classic dilemma since years and years and years that people are into. Planning each and every activity, either you resort to a separate planning section, like in the US, or you decide, like in France, it has a lot of implication, that planning is not a specific activity. So that planning should be incorporated in any and each activity. When you have more and more subcontractors, how do you organize your subcontracting work? And how, but for which activities do you choose to subcontract? And under what conditions? And the subcontractors are under whom in terms of their hierarchy? Mandatory control of activities, organizing control on which basis, who are the controllers? And I will tell you some of the options that organizations have. And regulation of the production process. Here again, you have all political science insight on capture, collusion, and if you're too hostile, this is not working also. So how to organize the relationship between regulators and regulatees? What are the options? Okay, those questions cannot be solved once and for all. It means that it's a constant reflexive effort that we need to have. The concrete and contingent organizational answers given to these problems, by and large, and I am convinced about that, determine the social construction of safety. And by the way, what do we know about the strategies that they have? Do we face a uniform response? So I'm going to take you to a journey to visit 3 different models. The opaque autonomy the logistic model, and the empowerment. This is entering the micropolitics of safety, and at the end I would like to know which model would you choose. And I will try to, answer this. Where is it heading? The opaque regime, there's a strict separation between those who design the work and those who execute. Taylor is not dead. The preparation of work is not really a priority, which leads to numerous surprises in the field. There's a rather informal control of activities in the field, and there's no delegation, no formal delegation of power to modify procedures when needed at the workers' level, which means that when they really need to and they are in a hurry and the outage schedule is pressing, workers and foremen have the tendency to solve problems by themselves. Safety authorities seldom on site. This is a distant oversight. You see a lot of informal adjustments to rule. A do-it-yourself attitude prevail. Balance. The strengths of this model are enormous. This is the kingdom of superheroes, fireman type, lots of creativity, lots of adaptability, great pleasure. We forget a lot of the times pleasure in life and pleasure at work, in troubleshooting activities. Of course, it comes at a price. Vulnerabilities here are massive. Lots of tacit knowledge, lack of transparency, low level of organizational learning, difficult for newcomers or subcontractors to get on board. Now I'm moving to a very different model, the logistic regime. There again you have strict separation between those who design the work and those who execute. But you have unlimited resources allocated to the people in the field in terms of helpers. They can ask low qualified people to just carry their tools, help them to get dressed, do all kinds of stuff. You have engineers completely devoted to them and all kinds of tools and parts, and you can ask for about anything. There's a detailed planning and preparation. Drills are occurring. People are rehearsing their activities 2 weeks prior to the exact time. And when procedures need modification, there's a dedicated engineering section that helps the worker to update them rapidly. The control of activities is entirely subcontracted. So there's the control is subcontracted. There's a heavy presence of safety authorities on site, and there's a deliberate opposition to unplanned initiatives. Okay, so there's hardly any informal adjustments that you can actually observe, and there's a go-by-the-book attitude that prevails. Balance. Okay, strengths. This is a very explicit organization with a constant dedication to upgrading procedures and policies, with a critical attention to planning and preparation. Okay, it comes also at a price. This is a rigid organization, not reactive, costly, not creative, with apathy and complacency easily develop. And people have the tendency to say, if you ask them a question, they say, oh, I have to ask my supervisor. Now I have a third regime, the empowerment regime. The execution teams, contrary to the two other, participate in creating and have the formal responsibility to update working rules, procedure, and safety policies. The modification they want on their procedures when they work are approved or not by the top management 24 hours, 7 days a week, allowing for a timely resolution of problems in the field. Control and surveillance, contrary to the logistic regime, are delegated to a member of the work team acting under the quality and safety department chief for a week at a time, talking about collusion. And I remember asking one person in this position, and I said, but you're controlling your own workmate, your own colleagues, and he said, yes, but no bad work can be hidden from me because I know them well and I know what are their little secrets. So safety authorities stay at a distance. In this model, workers play by the rule as long as they are involved in their drafting. when they are not consulted, they would breach the rules. Balance. It's the kingdom of journeymen. It's an old, we say in French, les compagnons. It's an old, really an old word. The expertise closest to the field is highly valued. Workers are empowered and look after any aspect of their working environment, from procedures to subcontracting. They are in charge of hiring the people as well, the outside people. But there's constant bypass of middle management. It's a punitive and blame culture, and people tend to over-defend their turf. I'm maintenance, you're ops, and I have nothing to do with you. When I say punitive and blame culture, it's meant like this: since there's so much responsibility in the field, then you pay for responsibility. If you screwed up, then you're punished. Okay, so I believe you realize that each model has its strengths and weaknesses. No regime is perfect, yet each of them is offering an answer to the dilemma detailed above. And these regimes are the kind of things one might expect from our organizations. What is ahead? And I see three possible choices. The technocrat's choice is more of the same. More separation between those who design technology, organization, procedure, and those who execute plan, work, and activities. Fewer in-house staff and personnel, and more contractors. Increase of the proceduralization, if it can be. Automation whenever possible. This will eventually work and continue to work if large resources are allocated for this model to actually perform or work. Compare the logistic model. The human-centered choice. Organization is seen as a waste of time, great contributor to events and accidents. We had for 20 or 24 years the human error as explaining everything. Now we have the organizational failure to blame for absolutely everything. And I think we are in this mode. The emphasis is put on first-line actors, their training, skills, and resources. And there's a great reliance on simulators. Not, for example, each nuclear power plant in France now, since it's been 5 years, has its own simulator. The hospital where I'm working right now and doing field work, they have their own simulator with a little baby mannequin baby. They show me that. We're very proud of it. Reliance on simulators, decision-making tools, and software. This might apply to specific population or segments of an organization, for example, doctors, surgeons, and pilots for the aviation. Certainly not for a whole range of other people in those organizations. And then the organizational center choice, and I'm not so happy about my way of summarizing. It's okay, it breaks the bureaucratic model, favors collective negotiation of options prior to the setup of organization. And I don't see a lot of reflection, discussion on models that we could, on how to design organization. Usually the technology comes in and then it's staffed, whatever, and then problem starts, but it's generally too late. Directly addresses the challenge they face, prescription versus autonomy, control versus ownership. Instead of ignoring that they have those problems to face daily, I think we should start from those challenges and then build something maybe different with the help of organization theory if the managers will listen. Okay, those are the reference and mention. Thank you.
I think we're now open for questions and comments. So please use the microphone up front here if you want to pose questions or remarks. Who wants to start? Please. And please mention your name and affiliation.
Yeah, my name is Harald Satrin. I'm at the University of Bergen here at the Department of Administration and Organization Theory. And I think this theme we are discussing here is a good example, a little bit contrary to the keynote speaker we heard this morning. This is applied social science. Whether it works is another matter. I would just like to relate a little bit to the first presentation here by Professor Perot. And I must say, I have a lot of sympathy with your strategy of reducing vulnerability through these tools that you mentioned. You had sort of 5 of them. Though I would also say, you know, obviously there are no easy solution in this in this field. I thought the second presentation illustrated that a lot. I mean, we end up with a very, very long laundry list of things to do. And being also an organizational theorist myself, I'm somewhat like the presentation. I'm somewhat sort of, how should I say it? I guess I'm more in the bounded rationality school of thought, and the implication of that is fairly clear. But let me get back to these 5 strategies that were, or tools of coping that were mentioned by Professor Perot. You mentioned dispersion of dangerous substances. I think that could be easily dealt with. Dispersion of vulnerable populations. Yes, I understand that. But what I wanted to relate to here is the breakup of large organizations. And secondly, somewhat related, decentralize them if breakup is not possible. I have myself worked with that issue a little bit in the public sector. So, you know, I'm not talking about now the efforts to try to break up Microsoft, but actually efforts to try to relocate public agencies from the capital usually to other parts of the country. There are a few countries who have actually tried to do this, the Scandinavian countries being one example, with the exception of Denmark, which is so small that, you know, but Finland, Norway, and Sweden have been trying to do this. Another country that I should mention is the UK. And I would just say this, to me, illustrates that to deal with these issues, you can't just rely on organization theory or management. You really have to go into the political science, public policy field too, because these decisions are not just made in single organizations. It's a little bit like what you saw in the 9/11 in the US. You have the parliament, you have the cabinet, you have a lot of interest groups involved in this area. And I would just say the Scandinavian experiences over the last 20, 30 years, there are probably 7 attempts to relocate public agencies from the capital to other parts of the regions. Of these 7 attempts, I would say probably 2 of them have been successful. One in Sweden in the 70s, where I actually managed to relocate some 50 agencies with 10,000 employees. It was enacted in the Swedish parliament in the early 70s. They actually implemented this. Norway was trying to do the same at the same time. And Norway, just to illustrate, has really much more sympathy for dispersal policies that you are advocating. But it was not really, they made a decision about this in the cabinet. They were not able to carry this through. And to understand this, you have to go back to political science. And of course, as you may know about Theodore Lowy, famous dictum, policies determine politics. So what are the policies we're talking about? This is what he would call redistribution policies. You create winners and you create losers. And when you're trying to pass this kind of legislation or decisions to the parliament, you come up with parliamentarians who are very concerned about who win and who lose. It's a little bit like closing bases in the US, you know, and we know how politicized this can be. So I'm just trying to, though I have a lot of sympathy with what you recommended, I guess my suggestion here is that there are 2 types of factors I would just sort of end by saying. Actually, the UK here is the success case. And I think that has something to do with the political system. It has to do with a Westminster kind of political system where winners, as we know, because of the electoral system, you have not just a strong cabinet because it's always a majority in the parliament, and it's a political culture that also creates a very strong prime minister. We saw that under Margaret Thatcher, and we can see it. The crucial thing in the UK is the ruling party, once it has consensus internally, it can do anything it pleases. It's not divided government, it's the opposite. I don't think this is a coincidence. The other factor I will just mention here is very important too. It has a lot to do with policy design and program design, how you organize the political process and how you organize the package that you have to come up. Who wins, who loses? Those two things. I just use that as an illustration that though I have a lot of sympathy with your sort of list of factors here, it's easier said than done. These are the most controversial type of policies, at least I've seen in the Scandinavian context. I have a lot of sympathy, and I can tell you Norway is one of the few countries in the world, as far as I know, who actually have an explicit dispersal settlement policies. But the trend in Norway is like everywhere else. There are more and more people gathering in the bigger cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pero, is it all about power, policy design, and polity?
I'm absolutely in agreement with that. It is about politics, and I've always felt that. To quote a line from Normal Accidents, the issue is not risk, but power, and that is the least quoted notion from that book in the literature, but for me it's the most important one. The issue is not risk, but power. I just make a couple of small points about this, though. You're talking about breaking up large organizations and resettlement of them. And that, of course, is very hard because of organizational interests. So why don't we start thinking about preventing them from getting so large in the first place? If we really had a sense that deconcentration of public as well as private organizations was important, then we would watch the growth in size and make sure that when they got to a certain size that the next edition would be in another place or another unit. And this has been done successfully by a medical firm, blocking on the name, Johnson & Johnson in the U.S. I don't know what the policy now is, but many years ago, perhaps a couple of decades ago when I was looking at it, they had a policy that when a unit got up to 200 people, it had to seriously consider breaking up. And if it hadn't by 300, it was forced to. And so it is, Johnson & Johnson is just a multiple unit, extremely decentralized corporation, very successful. Now it's successful because that's a lucrative market to be in, medicine and home remedies and things like that. It's hard to lose money in that market, but so that might not support my case so well, but still it's done better than its competitors, which are much more traditionally organized. So if we can't break up the big organizations, think about not trying to create more of them. But in terms of the private sector, we could. We almost broke up Microsoft. U.S. Steel was broken up. We've done it many times in the private sector in the U.S. When we had antitrust laws and a lot of preventative acts, too, preventing mergers with those laws. Those laws pretty much went out with Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter and Clinton, and haven't come back, and I don't think they will come back, but there's a chance now that we might get them.
Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Gordon McBain. I'm here actually representing, or as chair of the Scientific Committee for the new program, Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, which is, and if you come to the next session on hazard, you'll hear about it from various members. This is a new international research program to address many of the issues. but in my real life, I'm a professor at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. But I wanted to comment on this organizational aspect because I've also been for 6 years head of the Canadian Weather Service, which is a organization which has some relationship to hazards. And this whole sense of decentralization is important in a physical sense, but in a operational disaster-related organization, not only does the Weather Service have to be highly integrated, I believe, that's a bias of a former head of one, structurally within a country, but also has to connect internationally. So we have to have this balance between, let's say, it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation, all those good things that you talked about. But one of the key things, and with respect to the first commentator coming from a parliamentary system, which in Canada is, I would say, is largely dysfunctional now. That's my personal bias. But you have in federal states, you have federal-provincial relationships. And again, the questions organizationally, it comes down to politics as to how do you organize across responsibilities for who does flood versus weather versus earthquakes versus thing at a federal, provincial, municipal, and international thing. And I don't know if anyone would like to comment on how you can, let's say, get around some of these ideas which you talked about, Mr. Perot, Professor Perot, about decentralization, that kind of thing, when the need, I think, the need for, let's say, having national and international integration. I mean, Canada's Weather Service can't function if it doesn't get the information from the U.S. and all other countries around the world, and vice versa. And these make it vulnerable, but allow us to, well, anyway, we try to accommodate these kind of things. So if you had any comments on those kind of, as opposed to private sector, I would call public good organizations whose function is to deliver through the worst of the crises and maintain things in a society where, largely speaking, politics is to give the ministers, give the attractive things, the things that will get them reelected, which is not usually the weather forecasters. Anyway, any comments? Oh, I did want to say, as a last commercial announcement, there is the science plan for IRDR is on a desk just outside the door. For those of you who haven't collected one, make sure you do when you leave. Thank you.
Just one short comment. I never thought about this until you made your comment. But the weather system could be like the internet or the electric power grid. That is a very large system with very small nodes, a network system, and able to share information without any particularly strong command and control aspect to it. You need the internet has a command center, so to speak, but it's almost voluntary, and it's self-organizing, and I should think that you could develop the weather system in that direction fairly easily, but I've never had this notion before because I never thought about weather systems in organizational terms, and I apologize for not having done so.
I'd like to add something to that because I think it's pointing to an interesting tension that we're going to hear more of. It's been good practice to decentralize in terms to enable local crisis and disaster management. You know, the saying is that all disasters are local. Now, the question is if that will happen in the future. If crises are not going to be so local, but going to be transnational or transboundary, that may require supranational responses. And in the EU, that's exactly what we're seeing right now. The EU is building capacity to deal at the supranational level with crises and disasters. But this creates a huge void where at the national level, everything's pointing downwards to enable cities and regional authorities to organize the brunt of the disaster management, so they're not connected upwards towards a supranational level. So even if you create at the supranational level, you create capacity, the real question is going to be how you connect that with all those local centers of expertise, and that's going to be the challenge, because you don't want to organize a command and control system where everything is run from Brussels. Certainly not during a disaster, and that would definitely be a compounded disaster. But at the other hand, if we have, you don't want everybody just to fend for themselves. So you want to somehow generate, and this is the big coordination issue, and that we run into again and again. So I think this is going to be one of the design questions that we're going to be wrestling with in the future.
Okay, then we have Christopher Hood.
Christopher Hood, a question for Ian Boyne and Mathilde Bourrier. You both referred to blame games in your presentation. Both of you referred to blame games rather disparagingly. We were given to understand that blame games are a bad thing. I'd like to ask you whether you think blame games are all bad, whether they can in some circumstances have a positive function, for example, as a discovery process. So I wonder if someone could put in a good word for blame games. And secondly, even if they were all bad, I'd like to suggest that they're not eliminable. And isn't the real problem to design systems that go with the grain of blame games rather than against it? And how can we design systems that, as it were, go with the flow of the blame game imperative rather than against it?
Yes, blame game a good thing.
Well, of course, we always get the hard questions from Professor Hood. Thank you, Christopher. The blame game is the label for accountability processes gone bad, I would say. And of course, Professor Hood is absolutely correct, is that we need accountability, especially after disasters. And Professor Perot has been pointing to all sorts of processes that would be uncovered if we have proper accountability processes. I'm sorry. Now, when that turns into games, and I'm not sure if game is probably not the right word. It's the word used often. The technical term that social scientists might prefer is something like frame contests, where we're really trying to impose a definition of the situation, and which carries a narrative of who's done it, how bad is it, and what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And those competing processes, sort of frame competition, play out. They're very functional, I think, because it creates a debate that we should have. Now, the point is that this debate starts earlier and earlier as crises are unfolding. And we may wonder whether that's a good time for it. Now, the other side of it is the ritualistic sort of accountability process that we've been witnessing, and that don't really carry any sort of meaning, and they're really not going anywhere. They're just meant to provide closure and move on without changing anything. And obviously, that's what we don't need. So those are two extremes. So we're going to have to go somewhere in between. And I like the idea that the energy that these accountability, post-crisis accountability processes evoke should be used to explore how this happened and what can be done to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But then we're arriving at one of the hardest questions, and every time we see that the common sense approach, sort of let's really study this, runs into the politics of it, that has many powers saying that we shouldn't study this because we really don't want to get to the bottom of it. And I'm sure Professor Perot. Oh, Mathilde, you want to say something about that?
I think in my presentation, I don't see you anymore, but I refer to the blame and then the punitive culture for the empowerment model. And actually, people in this model perceive it rather well. I mean, they did not resent the fact that they would be taken accountable, because it was the exactly flip coin of responsibility. So my comment on that is that as long as people get to be in charge officially and with a real delegation of power, apparently they take much better the accountability and responsibilities that can go with a mistake. It is not the case in the model of the logistic model, where it's so diluted that actually tracing back a responsibility is much more difficult, and people tend to, take the blame to another person, and it's not a very efficient. And I'm not arguing that it's good to have a blame culture, but in this very case, it was not badly resented, even though there was a you could be demoted for 4 days and have to stay at home because you participate in an operation that didn't go well. Charles, do you want to comment? No. I don't know if it's responding.
Good morning. My name is Winnie Dagley from the University of the Philippines. I'm also a research assistant at the Earthquakes and Megacities Initiative, based in the Philippines. Yeah. My inputs would be more of validating my feelings about the second presentation of Professor Arjun. I have this feeling that we have already moved forward or beyond crisis management and building resilience or putting mechanisms for improving resilience right after the disasters. But I think we move forward to more of risk reduction paradigm, where we're looking at vulnerability factors, like what you have explained. And I'm explaining this because, for example, in developing countries like the Philippines, which is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, and of course in Asia, where a majority or most of the losses due to disasters occurred, I think it is more strategic and more effective to approach disasters by reducing the risk, especially in developing countries, because in the first place, we have no emergency management structures put in place. You mentioned that crisis management entails complicated, complex organizational structures to implement crisis management operations. But in developing countries in Asia, for instance, the local government doesn't have, or the government or the state doesn't have really the capacity to build, for example, just like in the United States, emergency operation centers, the proper structures, the even training emergency staff or emergency personnels. But I think the more salient feature in developing countries is the high vulnerability of the population. Like there are a lot of people who are living in more hazardous areas, and they don't have the capacity to build their resilience to those natural disasters. They don't have the money to, for example, retrofit their structures. And I think it is also a challenge for the social scientists. I think this is the entry point for social sciences, that we explore or we understand how we understand the vulnerabilities of populations and how to reduce such vulnerabilities. So in relation to that, my last point is that you're saying about, you explained about the transboundary nature of catastrophes. So I will relate that to what I've mentioned a while ago about risk reduction. And I think that it's also important to explore how are we going to approach risk reduction, how are we going to reduce the risk of transboundary catastrophes. For example, water pollution or oil spill in the Mekong River, for instance, that can affect different countries, or even I don't know, air pollution or related to environmental health, that sort of thing.
Well, thank you for your comment and question. I absolutely agree that much of the effort should be aimed at reducing risks of disasters, and the good news is that much of the research in disaster research is actually aimed at risk reduction. I think we've seen many successes in risk reduction, in many failures as well. The point I'm trying to make is that we're facing a different species of trouble, and I'm not saying it's the most dominant or the most frequent one. I'm saying it's a type of crisis that I believe is going to be, we're going to see more of that, the transboundary crisis. And it is my my fear that we will not be able to apply what we've learned about risk reduction with regards to, for instance, flooding, to these kind of crises, because of the very nature of these crises, because they play out over such a different scale, both geographically and across all these boundaries. It's going to be very, very hard to prevent them. Now, if we can't prevent those crises, we're going to have to think towards the other end. Now, Charles Perrault suggests that we should deconcentrate or break up our targets. Another strategy is the one that I'm offering, is to enhance our resilience. And it might very well be in terms of the resilience and in the developing countries that we can actually learn a lot about resilience in developing countries, for the simple reason that it's probably they're much better at it, because they're forced to be resilient, where we've in the rich countries have become kind of lazy in that sense. And you know, if you don't have daily adversity, if you're not trained in this, we simply we have no clue what that means anymore. So I think there's that is a tremendously interesting research opportunity to see, you know, what the factors are, and if there are successful factors. You know, if there are some societies that are more resilient than others. I mean, that's really a question, you know, where we have to go then. And if the Philippines, for example, have a track record of enhancing resilience, that should be studied and compared to countries that don't have that.
Thank you. Anything else?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the presenters for a number of interesting observations on the situation and the future. However, I think I've read those kinds of observations from the ecologist and the biologist at least in 3 decades. So I wonder, as social scientists, do we have greater ambitions, at least pretensions, than presenting those kinds of lists? Do we want to offer some interpretations of what is going on or not? There is 2 characteristics about which I was puzzled. Let me start with Mathilde Bourrier. We read Michel Crozier in the old days, And I noticed that her descriptions of French organizational life is much in common, but also many important, insignificant differences. There was, however, one very significant difference between her presentation and that of Michel Crozier. The absence of power in her presentation. These three models, which I thought was very stimulating and well taken, which model is about the empirical reality in French organizations now? Which one is dominating? Which one is not? There is no tabula rasa as which of these three will be chosen. I wonder if she could tell us something about the probability of which one will be chosen. And as we have the chance to speak to the doyen of organizational research, at least in this room, Professor Perrault, who also, of course, has not followed the mainstream American organizational research by paying much or concentrating on cognition as to why organizational behavior is as it is. He has very stimulatingly pointed out the role of power. And I think I will feel to be at a loss if you are here now, Professor Perrault, and referring to your book, this quotation about risk is important, but power is even more important. I wonder if you could lay out some comments to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is the last question, so we'll leave the...
Okay. Well, this is a very long question, and I don't know if I can answer this in a few minutes, but maybe over break we could talk more. I don't know, probably you don't know, but I've been trained by Michel Crozier, so that's why maybe you found some curious influence. And I think it's not that I don't talk about power. I think I talk about power all the time when I talk about those balance and then the fact that they power of the workmen and then power of the middle management and power of the top management. It's just that I deliberately chosen not to contextualize too much the three models, but obviously the first model looked more of a bricolage model and looked more of a let's say a French model than the two others, even though this first model disappeared more and more. The first model is under attack. So I don't think we'll go for this model. Or we'll go for this model in a very censure mode, let's say, that people are doing it completely undercover, and I'm not sure. We go much more for the logistic model if you have the money. And I can certainly refer to a study I did in the middle of the 2000 where the people were going for this model with no money. And it was very, very catastrophic. And the third model, nobody wants it. The empowerment. Because you give the empowerment to the people, to the lay people, and nobody wants it. So it's I think it's my favorite one, by the way. But I try to hide it a bit, because otherwise people get nervous. And then the three options that I summarize at the end probably will go for the technocratic model overall across industries. And some would, like aviation or hospital, continue to favor the human-centered model, well-equipped the man of the 22nd century, where it's all. So I don't see much option between the two, and it's my desire would be to see an option between the Superman and the super technocrat. All right.
Thank you. Would you have some ending comments on risk and power?
I wish we had. I wish I had an hour, or at least, or 2 hours. I would go into it in detail, but and it's hard to be very brief. Except that the rest of that quotation I now recall is that the issue is not risk but power, comma, the power of elites to determine the kind of risks that the rest of us will run. And so I would just say that my interest in power is just precisely that. What kind of risks do they put out for us? The elites put out nuclear power plants, for example. They took away the bayous of Louisiana and dug the shipping channels to increase the productivity of the port, and that made the risks greater. New Orleans would have been fine 50 years ago from that storm, but commercial and governmental interests decided to let New Orleans run the risk of destroying the wetlands that would weaken the storm and providing the infamous channel that would just funnel it up there. And so I think those are the key issues. I'm much more concerned about those than I am about how do we design resilient organizations, but I am concerned about that too, and there's a lot that we can do to make our risky organizations less risky and more resilient, but the basic problem goes way below that. What kind of organizations have we put around our world, and what kind of catastrophes do they entail?
Thank you very much. And then I think it's time to wrap up. So what have we learned from this session? I think the main thing that we have learned is that organizations matter. But on the other hand, how it matters and in what way it matters is really contested. But we really need to rethink our way on how we organize for crisis management. Charles Perrow, he points to deconcentrating, breaking up large organization and decentralization. Arjen Boyn points to enhancing resilience, and Mathilde Bourrier points to empowering regimes as sort of solutions. And I think we have to go on in that kind of directions and try to do our research and try to be more precise about how to organize for crisis management and disaster management. Organizations are critical actors in crisis and crisis management. They both process and handle risks and are also potential producers of risk. So they simultaneously process and neglect risks, and that's why we really need to understand how organizations change and are organized in this field. I just want to end this panel by thanking the panel participants and the audience, and also the panel sponsors, which are Statskraft and the Directorate for Civil Protection and Emergency Planning in Norway. So thank you very much all. And I also want to point to this panel 2 of this stream on environmental hazards and social catastrophes, which is on disaster risk management and climate change adoption, different or the same. And we invite you all to that panel, which starts at 2 o'clock today after the lunch break. Thank you all. Thank you. I think it was a great panel.